Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this very special event entitled Nowhere Else, South Carolina and the Legacy of Scientific Racism. My name is Molly Rogers, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities at New York University, and we are very pleased to be hosting this event. The event stems from a chapter in To Make Their Own Way in the World, the enduring legacy of the Zealy daguerreotypes, recently published by Aperture and the Peabody Museum Press. I had the privilege of co-editing this book with Deborah Willis, chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts here at NYU, and Elisa Barbash, curator of visual anthropology at Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. The book project was a decade in the making and involved some more than 20 contributors, including scholars, students, and artists. Each contribution builds upon existing scholarship on the Zealy daguerreotypes, a few of which I will show in just a moment, and furthers our understanding of a terrible period in American history, one with repercussions down to our current time. Tonight's discussion focuses on one chapter from the book, Harlan Greene's Nowhere Else, South Carolina's Role in a Continuing Tragedy. I hope you've had a chance to read Harlan's chapter, but we will summarize it here, so don't worry if you haven't been able to do so. In a moment, I will introduce to you our wonderful guests, and then I will introduce to you the book itself to provide some context for Harlan's work. I'll then hand you over to Harlan, who will summarize key points from his essay, and then we'll hear from our distinguished panelists. So let me introduce to you our panelists. Harlan Greene is scholar in residence at Addlestone Library, College of Charleston, where he previously served as head of special collections and as manager of reference and archival services at the college's Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. He's also a prize-winning novelist and the author of numerous books and articles on the culture and history of South Carolina Lowcountry, including Mr. Skylark, John Bennett and the Charleston Renaissance from 2001, and Slave Badges and the Slave Hire System of Charleston, South Carolina, 1783 to 1865, with Harry S. Hutchins Jr. and Brian E. Hutchins, published in 2003. Our second panelist, Dr. Bernard Powers, is Emeritus Professor of History at the College of Charleston and also director of its Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston. His Black Charlestonians, a social history 1822 to 1885, was designated an outstanding academic book by Choice magazine. He co-authored We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel, published in 2016, which contextualizes the city's 2015 racially motivated murders. His most recent book is 101 African Americans Who Shaped South Carolina, published by USC Press last year. Dr. Powers is also the interim CEO of Charleston's International African American Museum. Our third panelist tonight is Jennifer Berry Hawes. She's a reporter on the Charleston Post and Courier's Watchdog and Public Service team, which handles investigative and other in-depth stories. She was on the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2015 and was a Pulitzer finalist in feature writing in 2019. Her book, Grace Will Lead Us Home, about the Emanuel AME Church shooting, was published in 2019 by St. Martin's Press. That book has won numerous national awards and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2019. Tonight's discussion has as its starting point 15 photographs that were made in 1850 in Columbia, South Carolina. These images were made under violent circumstances, and they are difficult and painful to look at. I will not show them all tonight, but just a few of them so you have a sense of their impact. They show 7 men and women, 5 men who were all born in Africa, whose names are Jen, Alfred, Renty, Fasna, and Jack. The 2 women, Delia and Drana, are daughters of the men. Delia is Renty's daughter and Drana is Jack's daughter. All of these people were enslaved in South Carolina, many on plantations near Columbia. They were photographed in frontal and profile views with their clothes partially or completely removed. Needless to say, consent was not obtained from the people that we see here to take these photographs. The photographs were made using an early photographic process called daguerreotypy, and they were taken by a Columbia man, Joseph Zealy. You can see his name on the velvet lining of the daguerreotypes. And this is why we call them the Zealy daguerreotypes. In 1976, the photographs were discovered in the attic of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Museum staff conducted research on the daguerreotypes and the people depicted in them, working from clues given in the labels attached to the daguerreotype cases. From their research and from the research that was taken subsequently, show you more of them. We know that the photographs were commissioned by a local physician in Columbia and an amateur paleontologist by the name of Dr. Robert Wilson Gibbs. And they were commissioned for a Harvard professor, the naturalist Louis Agassiz. The purpose of these photographs was to support an early theory of human diversity. And here's a slide of the labels that were on the daguerreotypes that show us the name of the person depicted and some biographical information about them. I also have here a picture of Louis Agassiz himself, the one on the left, of course. Agassiz believed that human diversity was best explained by polygenesis, which was also called separate creations. This theory held that God had created people of different colors at different times and different locations, which meant that one group did not descend from or even relate to another. Africans and Europeans, for example, were therefore entirely separate beings with no common biological history. This idea was largely debunked in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. But the basic idea behind polygenesis, that there were natural, immutable biological differences between different groups of people that we call races, this idea continues to affect minds today, as we will soon discuss. In the spring of 1850, Agassiz traveled to Columbia to examine the people we see here. Dr. Gibbs subsequently commissioned the daguerreotypes from Zealy and then sent them north. The daguerreotypes were therefore made under violent circumstances to support racist scientific theories that were embraced and perpetuated by white plantation owners and politicians to defend slavery. They are, in short, objects implicated in white supremacy. At the same time, however, these photographs also show us individuals, not the types that Agassiz wanted to study, but 7 individuals about whom we would know little to nothing if not for the existence of these images and the labels attached to them. Tonight's event is not about the daguerreotypes themselves, so much as about the specific local conditions that made them possible, and about how some of those conditions are with us still today. In his essay, Harlan Greene writes, quote, "It is not at all accidental or coincidental that these daguerreotypes of enslaved African Americans, taken with the most advanced technology used to support theories masquerading as science, came out of South Carolina. For 3 elements, an obsession with race, a drive to document and describe the natural world as a part of scientific inquiry, and the eager and early embrace of technology, were all a part of South Carolina's cultural milieu in the antebellum era. In fact, all had been part and parcel of South Carolina's psyche since its beginnings." With that, I'm going to hand over the screen to Harlan Greene, who is going to give us a summary of his chapter and of his view about Nowhere Else. Thank you, Harlan.
Okay, well, thank you, Molly. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to do my PowerPoint up and take it away from that. And as Molly says, this is such a complicated issue, and I thought the way to start is maybe to just jump into the idea of stereotypes and how we suffer from them. And specifically tonight, we're addressing the stereotypes of African Americans that were foisted off on the world by some of those people she mentioned, politicians, people, and by scientists of the past. And I wish it was still in the past, but they're still inflicting damage today. You know, but there are stereotypes all around us, and specifically being from South Carolina and being from the South, where we're all coming from, we're also the victim of stereotypes as well, too, often. In 2014, a South Carolina schoolgirl petitioned the state legislature to try to get the woolly mammoth to be our state fossil, to go along with our state insect, our state dance, and our state beverage, et cetera. But it wasn't so easy, because if we believed in fossils, our state legislators believed that might rule out creationism, and that might mean that the world was not created in 7 days, and that might get a politician unelected from office here in the South. So those are some of the stereotypes that we have about the South, that, you know what, maybe we're not real scientific, that we're a place of spittoons and buffoons and place like that. But the interesting thing was, as Molly said, in the 1850s, and this is an image of Charleston in that time period when the advancement of science meeting met here. In the 1850s, you know, South Carolina really was at the head of science. In that meeting that she references, one of the scientists there coming from Boston basically said, quote, "In science, South Carolina has stood almost alone in the South." So that's the basis for our title tonight, Nowhere Else on Earth, because nowhere else in the South but South Carolina was the study of science so advanced in the 1850s. Also, too, I'm going to talk about the other things that she mentioned as well. So South Carolina, as Molly said, was founded in 1670. By 1709 or so, it was already a Black majority. We grew to be an incredibly wealthy state because of the enslavement of African Americans. And so these elite whites did not have to work, and that allowed them to actually spend their time kind of, you know, spinning theories and thinking about science. John Garden of South Carolina, very early on, you know, we're always scientifically focused. He corresponded with Linnaeus, you know, and it's Linnaeus that maybe we can blame or say who started that binomial nomenclature and started the hierarchical view of human beings or of taxonomy, that some things were higher than others. So South Carolinians started corresponding with Linnaeus, an image of him here too, and Linnaeus actually names the gardenia for John Garden of South Carolina. But early on, there's all sorts of other naturalists here. Here's a beautiful bird by Audubon. Mark Catesby is in South Carolina in the 1700s. Audubon is here in the 1800s. And they're all doing this thing. They're doing flora and fauna. They're doing genus and species. They're always trying to examine things, name things, put things in slots, and say, this is this, and ranking things in the order of creation. And it's not just visiting people that come through here as well, too. Title page of the Flora Caroliniana. So this, in 1788, a local from South Carolina creates, you know, the first book in America that's actually using the Linnaean taxonomy, the first, excuse me for the quote, the first regional botanical work in North America to use the Linnaean system of classification. So there's something about here very early on, long before these daguerreotypes come along, people are obsessed with classifying things. So that by the time of the 1850s that come along, one of the most famous scientists of the day in South Carolina is John Edwards Holbrook. Holbrook's focus is on reptiles, and he does his herpetology of North America, you know, considers the reptiles and et cetera of North America, and it is considered the premier book of its type. And he is not an artist. Audubon drew his own drawings. Catesby drew his own things. Here's where we start moving towards Zealy. What Holbrook did is he used technology, used other people to draw and thing as well too. And these are created before the daguerreotypes are. But you can see these things are already in the air in South Carolina. And I hate to make the comparison, but you can see what Holbrook is doing in these. He's actually showing, like those you saw, those horrific daguerreotypes, he's showing front and back. He's showing sexual organs of animals. And this is the type of thing that's in the air in South Carolina. This is what scientists are doing in South Carolina. They're drawing the natural world and using technology to do it. And so from Holbrook, and this is Gibbs that Molly talked about. Gibbs is not as good a scientist as Holbrook is, but he sees these books. He has access to these books. And so then this kind of gives him the idea that if this is what's being done about human nature, then maybe I can do this, or this is what's doing about the animal kingdom, then maybe I can flip this to other things as well too. So he's the one, as Molly said, who actually brings these enslaved people, Delia, Renty, Jack, Jem, Alfred, Drana, and Fassina. He's the one who actually brings them into Zeeley's studio in Columbia. And we saw his handwriting. So Gibbs wants to get in on the idea of taxonomy, and he's really, really bad at it. We have examples of things that he tried to do, but you can see exactly what he's doing with these people. So this is actually kind of a quick logical conclusion of what is happening in the field of science is all these other scientists, natural historians before him have been using artistry, et cetera, to deal with the animal kingdom. And this is the logical, unfortunately, next step that Gibbs is taking it to human beings as well. And you saw the images showing the human being's face front, showing the human being's profile, and trying to actually classify them and say things as well too. So that's how we got here by science. And as Molly said, there were three things. South Carolina was also obsessed with the Negro from the very beginning of its founding. As I said, founded in 1670, by 1709, there was already a Black majority here. And so, you know, there is the stereotype around in the world, and I hope I don't offend anybody by using it, but that's the nature of stereotypes, is, you know, that all African Americans look alike. But in South Carolina, that was never the case. And I'm going to quote again from another historian, Peter Wood, the classic historian of African American history in South Carolina in the colonial time period. Most white colonists, he wrote, would have marveled at their descendants who asserted blindly that all Africans looked the same. Actually, in Carolina, people were connoisseurs of Africans. And you can see it here in this advertisement of Africans to be sold, brought off the ship. You can actually see that South Carolinians, long before scientists started doing it, started typing African Americans, basically saying Mandingos were supposed to be attractive and refined. Caramontes were supposed to be fiercely loyal and impossible to control. Pawpaws were the best workers, people believed, and those from Angola and Congo were good with the mechanical arts, but likely to run away. So even before scientists start this classification, South Carolinians, with so many African Americans around them, they're classifying Negroes themselves too, to try to, you know, to figure out how they can best work in our culture here. And again, a horrifying image in its own way, perhaps not as starkly horrifying as Molly's, is this one here. You know, here we can see, you know, this is what South Carolina put on its money, the Bank of Charleston, the Farmers and Exchange Bank. Here you can see again, we are using images of African Americans as beasts in the field who are parts of our economy. So it's not just scientists that are doing this, it's not just people on the streets that are doing this, but it's actually politicians, and even the economy is doing this image of African Americans, you know, as being somewhat different from you know, the other people, again, you know, than white Caucasian Americans. And unfortunately too, this also ties in another thing as well for our title, Nowhere Else. And when writing this essay and figuring out how to title it, all these 19th century phrases kept coming up. Here's the Medical College of South Carolina, founded in 1824. And when they started advertising the opening of the medical college, this is what they said in their opening brochures. Quote, "No other place in the United States offers as great opportunities for the acquisitions of anatomical knowledge," and noted that subjects for dissection being obtained from among the colored population in sufficient number for every purpose without offending any individual in the community. So thus they were saying it was okay to use African bodies for dissection, and that would not bother people, and not European bodies. And again, when in their opening literature, they said, "The Southern student can nowhere else receive correct instruction on the diseases of our own climate or the peculiar morbid affections of the colored population." So nowhere else in the South was science so elevated and then got to be so debased. Nowhere else were African Americans so prevalent and so ubiquitous and so necessary to keep this peculiar economy going. So it's not surprising at all that kind of science got in the bed with racism to lead Delia, Renty, Jack, Jem, Alfred, Drana, and Fassina into that daguerreotype studio in 1850. And here is Louis Daguerre. So you couple the fact that people are fascinated with science, people are fascinated with African Americans, and people, need to see African Americans differently. Do that embrace with technology, and then you see how those daguerreotypes came along. And South Carolina, again, in 1850s, was very advanced in science. So Daguerre's inventions for this photographic process actually hits America in September of 1839. 2 weeks later, there's a manual that comes to America explaining how amateur people can do that too. So by the very next day of this manual hitting the United States of America, there is a daguerreotype produced by 2 professors from Columbia College in the South Carolina College in Columbia. So you can actually see then that we're embracing this technology as well too. And so that, in this very quick minute, is actually going back to the title as well too, is trying to say, and I'll sum it up, that so nowhere else in South Carolina other than South Carolina in the South, was daguerreotyping so advanced. Nowhere else was the knack for science so pronounced. Nowhere else was racism so ingrained in our society. And it was all these 3 factors that came together in that daguerreotyping studio that produced those very, very disturbing images. Now I'm going to let my colleagues go on with Bernie Powers. And then when Jennifer comes on there, it's this horror of repetition of history. She is going to take up what happened 165 years to the day that these daguerreotypes were finished. And now I'll hand it over to you, Bernie.
Okay, well, Harlan, thank you. Thank you so very much. I enjoyed that tremendously. Molly, thank you for your gracious invitation to be here and also your gracious introduction tonight. So let me amplify Harlan's point that South Carolina has a distinctive spot in American racial history, and that the state has been obsessed with race by adding the following points. The South Carolina slaveholders' consciousness of African ethnicity and of the different physical types that they observed was distinctive because the Atlantic slave trade would last longer in South Carolina compared to any other place, and was finally only ended in 1808. And it ended as a result of the passage of a federal prohibition. So this is a point that I will return to a little bit later, meaning the highly Africanized character of South Carolina's slave population, because it bears some additional emphasis. But let me just point out some additional points of distinction. As Harlan has pointed out, the colony has a Black majority as early as 1708, and that Black majority is persistent for the most part until the decade of the 1920s. By 1860, the state has 100,000 more Blacks than whites. And Harlan observes in the chapter that by 1840, 131 pages in the state statute books were devoted to laws designed to bring about the better regulation of Negroes and slaves, which suggests a real conflict and a real contest for control. But also, South Carolina has the highest incidence of slaveholding compared to every other state. In other words, just under 1/2 of the white families in the state in 1860 owned slaves. And that is about twice the average for the entire region of the South. Now, in the South, one of the most pervasive stereotypes of the enslaved population was the Sambo stereotype. And this was the hapless male slave, physically an adult, but with a childlike mentality. And Sambo was also supposedly shiftless, lazy, irresponsible, imitative, happy-go-lucky, motivated by pleasure, and utterly dependent upon whites for direction. Now, there were many reasons why this stereotype existed, and one of the most important was that by consigning Black males to the status of adult children, whites, as a result, did not really have to think about them as people like themselves, and they certainly did not have to think about them as men. But simultaneously, slaveholders recognized the stereotype of Nat. And Nat was the sullen, bloodthirsty, vengeful rebel who could emerge at a moment's notice, given the opportunity. And these existed simultaneously, or at least they could exist simultaneously, and both could be harbored in the same person. Remember, Nat Turner was an indulged slave and considered exemplary in his comportment. Also, remember, many of the enslaved organizers of the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy in Charleston were similarly privileged and considered exemplary. Now, in her Civil War diary, South Carolina's Mary Boykin Chestnut recalled 2 occasions when indulged slaves murdered their owners while they slept. And in reaction, she said this, quote, "I am sure I will never sleep again without this nightmare of horror haunting me." We ought to be grateful that any one of us is alive, unquote. But then she went further and said, quote, "But nobody is afraid of their own Negroes. These are horrid, brute savages, monsters. But I find but everyone like myself ready to trust them in their own yard." Now, historian John Blassingame described the plantation as a battlefield where slaves and masters fought with one another over physical and psychological survival. Now, keep that in mind as you remember what you've already heard tonight. And what you've heard is that 5 of the 7 men and women in the Zealy daguerreotypes were Africans. And that's significant and tells us these things. First of all, the fact that they're African tells us how prominent the African element in the slave population was, even as late as the eve of the Civil War. But secondly, that fact also tells us how geographically pervasive and extensive the African element amongst the slaves was too, because remember, the people that we are talking about tonight, they resided in the Columbia area, which is over 100 miles away from the coast of South Carolina. But ultimately, the fact that so many of the subjects that we're talking about tonight, and by implication, so many of the members of the South Carolina slave population were African in origin, tells us how difficult emancipation would be in South Carolina, because the gulf between whites on the one hand and an African or profoundly highly Africanized Black majority population was so great. Now, many prominent whites, from Thomas Jefferson to Alexis de Tocqueville to T.R.R. Cobb, the Georgia lawyer and pro-slavery author, they all asserted that if emancipation occurred, if it occurred, it would be accompanied by race war. And white Carolinians believed that any such conflict in their state would be particularly vicious because Africans represented such a large component of the Black population. And of course, they were considered to be the least civilized and the most savage and brutal amongst all people of African origin. White Carolinians knew what to expect based on their observations, but also what they heard or read about the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century and early years of the 19th. And in the 1850s, secessionist parlance was replete with hypothesized descriptions of the aftermath of emancipation, as for example, leading to, quote, the beastly horrors of the French Revolution in Saint Domingo, unquote. So it is no wonder then that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the nation. In South Carolina, particularly, secession was designed to preserve white life. Now, while the bloody uprising whites anticipated among the former slaves never materialized after emancipation, Black freedom was considered an assault on Southern whites in other ways, and especially against white men. Firstly, just the existence of freed people symbolized the Southern defeat, and in particular, the defeat of white men. But secondly, the Civil War death toll directly affected white men. And during the war, South Carolina lost about 23% of its young white men, and about 13,000 white men died, which was the largest, the greatest death toll for all of the Confederate states. But thirdly, Harlan's chapter asserts that in the antebellum years, the way that society defined Black life and opportunity simultaneously defined white life, opportunity, and also identity. Well, the same is true after the war. Now consider the images of Drana and Delia, the two bare-breasted Black women in the photos. And there they are reduced to objects for the gaze of white men in 1850. This was the ultimate insubordination. But here is the point. In the antebellum era, white men had access to and controlled all women. But with emancipation, Black women were withdrawn from the white male gaze and grasped as never before. Thus, emancipation had a forceful gendered impact and undermined the traditional sense of white manhood. Now, emancipation was followed by Reconstruction, that very brief period of interracial democracy. It was ended by 1877 in South Carolina and indeed throughout the South, and white supremacy was restored, sort of, but all was not right in the white psyche. Because even in the 1890s, some Black men still voted and even held public office. But all was not right mainly because of the rise of what whites called a new Negro. And by that, they meant a new generation of Black people, and especially Black men, who had been born in freedom and who were far less deferential toward whites, less fearful of them, and reckless and subversive of the racial etiquette that whites had traditionally demanded. But it wasn't just Black disregard for traditional racial etiquette that raised white ire. Southern whites also charged these so-called new Negroes were reverting back to a barbaric, bestial primitivism. These were supposedly natural tendencies which led to crime, but they were also supposedly enhanced by the brief but frustrated experience of social equality experienced during Reconstruction. And so in the minds of of white men, the most vulnerable group and the one most likely to be victimized by Black men was white women. And white men then vowed to protect them at all costs. And so all of these stereotypes, the stereotype of Reconstruction as the blackout of honest government, the stereotype as Black men as undisciplined, rapists, lusting for white women, and the stereotype of white men as virtuous, avenging patriarchs, all of these crystallized together in the latest technology of the early 20th century, the cinematic breakthrough film of 1915, known as The Birth of a Nation. And in that film, the Reconstruction era in South Carolina, which is a major focus of the film, Reconstruction here is presented in a most revolting and negative way. The film portrays Black men as ignorant, vicious, rapists, and romanticizes the KKK as heroes who lynched Black men in order to protect white women's virtue. So in these two cases, the Zeile daguerreotypes and The Birth of a Nation, these latest technologies gave those who used them a certain understanding of their past, their present, and their future. And in these cases, gave them a very dangerous and distorted understanding of those things with real world consequences. As just one example, after a special screening of Birth of a Nation at Woodrow Wilson's White House and the film's release, the KKK was publicly reborn later in 1915. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Really wonderful through line there from the daguerreotypes and even earlier right through into the 20th century. Jennifer, you're up next, bringing us even further into the present time.
Thank you. And I want to echo what everyone said and thanking you for having me on this panel. It's such a fascinating topic and an important one. So thank you. And yes, I want to take what has been discussed and move it forward into South Carolina today, looking at it through the shooting at Emanuel AME Church and the events that led to that. But I wanted to frame my comments in terms of a quote that to me really summarizes where we've come from and what we're looking at today in terms of the ongoing persistent nature of this problem. And it's from Brian Stevenson, who of course is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. And he said, this was from a 2019 interview, he says, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They weren't required to repudiate and acknowledge the wrongfulness of bigotry and slavery. They actually glorified that era. And this narrative war, which is basically a racist propaganda campaign to formulate a stereotype of African Americans, of course, was designed to ensure that white people remained in power politically, economically, and otherwise, and is a stereotype that persists today and played out in this especially horrific fashion in 2015 here in Charleston. As Harlan noted earlier, it was exactly 165 years to the day when Agassiz, Zeile, and Gibbs conspired to complete the making of the daguerreotypes when Dylan Roof, who was a 21-year-old South Carolinian, drove to Charleston to kill 9 African Americans in their church after they had welcomed him to join their Bible study. Now that day, Roof drove from Columbia, where of course the daguerreotypes were made, to Charleston, where Agassiz and Gibbs had just attended a symposium of the AAAS. So it's interesting that this journey is the same, although of course he went in reverse. Now, Roof chose Emmanuel and Charleston for some very specific reasons. He chose Emmanuel because it has been such a long-standing sacred place of refuge for African Americans in the city of Charleston and beyond. And he chose Charleston because of its history, a shameful history, although Roof did not see it that way. Charleston, by some estimates, was the port through which about 40% of captive Africans who were brought to the United States to be sold into slavery, through which they came. So it was the epicenter of the slave trade in America, and that drew Roof's attention. So before he left Columbia, however, he wrote up, or he took a journal that he had written up, and he typed it into his computer and uploaded it onto a rudimentary website called lastrhodesian.com. And in this writing, he wanted to communicate his viewpoint so that people would understand why he was committing this crime. He wanted them to understand his newly radicalized embrace of this narrative that Stevenson describes, which he calls his awakening. Now, it would be easy to assume that Roof came to be radicalized in his community, that he was radicalized within his family, given the history of South Carolina and certainly the undercurrent of racism that persists. But in fact, that's not exactly true. He writes as one of the first sentences in his manifesto, as it comes to be known, "I was not raised in a racist environment." And I think what he means by that is he was not raised in an environment of this sort of virulent, the level of racism that he has come to adopt, that he didn't learn that in his family, that specific degree of it. So where did he learn it? Where was he radicalized? Well, it was online. And it began with the Trayvon Martin case. So Dylan Roof had heard about that case, which you'll remember dealt a lot with issues of racial profiling, and he did not understand why it was such a big deal. So he goes onto Wikipedia, does some basic research, and then he types into the Google search bar the words "black on white crime." And the Google algorithm of the day brings to him, of course, a list of choices, and among them, the website for the Council of Conservative Citizens, which sounds pretty benign, right? It sounds like a right-leaning political website. So he clicks on it, and on this website, he discovers these really gruesome depictions of African Americans killing white people, and this message that the mainstream liberal media is ignoring all of this as part of some effort to be politically correct and whatnot. So from there, Roof really jumps down this rabbit hole into this universe online of white supremacy. He spends particular time on two, which were the biggies at the time, Stormfront and the Daily Stormer. He did not realize at the time that there was a very concerted effort by white supremacists to present their message in an increasingly normalized fashion to attract people like him who might not have clicked on it if they knew what it was at first. And as proof of that, I would point out that Dylan Roof drove to Charleston the day after Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. And in short order, a man named Andrew Anglin, who was the founder of the Daily Stormer website, endorsed him. And he changes the masthead on the website to read America's #1 most trusted Republican news source. So again, it sounds very benign, sounds like a political website. He announces his endorsement, as does Don Black, who's the founder of Stormfront, which is the other very large, hundreds of thousands of members, white supremacist website. So it starts to sound like very normalized political activity. And it is designed to lure in people like Roof, who didn't go searching for that message, but found it. And very quickly, Roof drapes himself in the messaging of these websites. He creates a username on them. His username was Lil Arian, L-I-L, Lil Arian. He asks, hey, is anybody else from Columbia? Maybe we can meet up. he finds this online world of people, and suddenly he's a part of this. And I think it's important to understand how much that messaging that Dr. Powers mentioned earlier and that Brian Stevenson describes in that narrative, how little that's changed. And I want to read a couple snippets from Ruth's journal. And I would caution they're very offensive. So if you don't want to listen to it, to just turn your volume down for maybe 30 seconds. I'll zip through them quickly. But I think it's important to make that connection. In one place he writes, even today, Blacks are viewed as lower beings by white people on a subconscious level. And this is why we continue to feel sorry for them for no reason. Blacks are held to a lower standard in general. This is why they're able to get away with things like obnoxious behavior. Again, going to what we were just listening to in the depictions in Birth of a Nation. In another part, Ruth uses the N-word. He says they're stupid and violent. At the same time, they're very slick and conniving. Again, the same messaging that we just heard about. Negroes have lower IQs, lower impulse control, and higher testosterone levels in general. These three things alone are a recipe for violent behavior. Again, the same messaging all these years later, and Ruth has embraced this on these websites, clearly not seeing the great irony of he is attributing these, he's attributing these things to African Americans when he himself is getting ready to go commit an act of such unspeakable violence that most of us cannot comprehend of it. And yet that's what he wrote. And from there, he becomes very interested in Charleston and begins to make a series of journeys here where he visits a number of the area's very finely preserved plantations. He takes selfies of himself in front of restored slave cabins. He poses in front of a marker on Sullivan's Island, which is a barrier island to Charleston, where many captive Africans were kept for quarantine purposes. He poses in front of a marker that's intended to be a solemn remembrance to that. He also waves the Confederate flag, which at the time was still flying out in front of the state capitol, in front of the State House, which was just a few blocks away from his father's home. He essentially immerses himself in this messaging that is still so present and accessible and visible in a place like Charleston and really most parts of South Carolina. He also compiles a list of Black churches, and Emmanuel is at the top of the list. There's a half dozen of them, and he selects them again for the history that they represent. He wants to make the biggest impact and commit his crime in a place which it will generate the most outrage and the most attention to his views, which is the reason he committed this crime, is he wanted to draw attention to these views. He also adopts the iconography of the white supremacist groups. He creates a little logo with his initials, and it has numbers like 88, which 88 it's actually a Nazi term or a Nazi number that references the 8th letter of the alphabet and Heil Hitler. He uses the number 14, which is a reference to the white supremacist slogan, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for our white children. So where did Dylan Roof learn about things like the number 88 and the number 14? Again, he learned about this all online, because that technology that we've been discussing has for so long now provided a way to encapsulate these views and then spread them. That's what the daguerreotypes were intended to do. That's what Birth of a Nation did. And that's what these websites do. And now social media platforms. So fast forward through President Trump's time in office, past Charlottesville, and to the Capitol riots. Well, what did we see there? But a large number of people from really desperate different groups who have some similarities in their ideologies, but nonetheless have coalesced around this idea and descended on the Capitol. Well, how did they do that? They did that by communicating on social media. These platforms have changed since Dylan Roof set out for Charleston, but the the web has nonetheless provided the technology for people to group up and take that narrative that began in the South and spread it all around the globe. And where that goes from here maybe is the topic of a panel for another day, or if there's questions about that, but that is going to be a persistent problem that our country needs to grapple with. I do, before I close out, want to mention there have been some changes in South Carolina that I think are worth mentioning since the Emanuel shooting. The Confederate flag, of course, came down from the State House. The John C. Calhoun statue, which towered literally over the city of Charleston, was taken down. The Charleston City Council apologized on behalf of the city for its role in the institution of slavery, albeit by a narrow vote. And hopefully next year we'll see the opening of the International African American Museum, which Dr. Powers can certainly talk more about, which I hope and I'm sure will provide a much more accurate narrative that we can be discussing at that time. So I'm using up all my time, but I want to thank you all and certainly help answer any questions that I'm able to. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And we will get to audience questions. We have a couple already. Feel free at any time to put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can see them and address them. I'm really fascinated by the way you've all talked about technology, different technologies, and how the message sort of always seems to find a new way to get out there. But maybe before we get into that, I'm really struck, Jennifer, by, it may not seem obvious at first, but the connections between Ruth and Louis Agassiz. You know, one was a largely unemployed youth, and the other is a famous European naturalist who comes to Harvard. But the way that you described Ruth, the way he was radicalized, the way these people, nobody is born racist. You know, we don't come out of the womb with these ideas. We learn them, we acquire them, and so the ways in which they acquired them, and Agassiz acquired his views from scientific colleagues, from the Philadelphia physician Samuel Morton, who was measuring the skulls, the capacity of skulls of people of different races, and drawing conclusions about intellect based on that. And Morton greatly influenced Agassiz. So that's where Agassiz was sort of indoctrinated, and technology wasn't involved there, but it was still, the message was passed on. But there's also this attention seeking. You know, Agassiz was a very flamboyant man. He was a well-known public speaker. And I did both, I think you, Jennifer, and Harlan both referred to the scientific meeting in 1850 that Agassiz went to in Charleston prior to going to Columbia, prior to meeting up with Gibbs and being taken to Columbia to see the Africans there. But at this meeting, Agassiz was constantly putting himself forward and courting the press, and he was seeking attention. And so to me there's something really fascinating about the way these two men, though completely different, centuries apart, but the way racism moves through them is somewhat similar. Jennifer, Harlan's got his hand up. He's clearly eager to say something.
I'll just, and I'll use my fingers to make ditto marks, but I think you can also put Robert Gibbs in there as well too. Here he was a minor scientist who really did not know what he was talking about, you know, but he was so impressed by Agassiz, and he was so impressed by people, his betters, Holbrook. He wanted to make an impression too. So he's the one, you know, that's giving these taxonic names to these people. And it strikes me again that Dylan Roof is doing exactly the same thing too, you know, through racism, and by embracing this belief, I can be like these bigger people who believe these things as well. So that seems to be something running through not just Agassiz and Dylan Roof, but many people along the way, you know, trying to, you know, use this faux science, you know, this faux science to raise themselves up into being in that same great circle. And obviously Dylan Roof is the most obvious example, I guess, to us, seeing that he thought, you know, posting, like you said, Jennifer, his narrative online, that was going to make him famous. Mm-hmm. And he was going to start that race war that he thought, that Bernie had mentioned, that thought, that was going to happen at the end of the Civil War. So thanks for making me think of that. I had not thought of that before.
Well, it's interesting, the Southern Poverty Law Center has looked a lot at these mass shooters who have a white supremacist ideology, and came to some very similar conclusions, looking at how many of them are very disaffected, many were unemployed, kind of adrift, often living still in their parents' home, no job, that sort of thing. And it is striking to think of that the way they see to make their name is by committing these horrific acts against other people and uplifting themselves through that idea of the other, that the other is responsible for everything that's wrong in my life and not me and my choices and my lack of whatever. So I think that Ruth really fits into that archetype. But also, you imagine Ruth now, and apparently he receives tons of mail. He's somebody who's very sought after. There was this whole very strange group of adolescent girls who became very obsessed with him on Tumblr, and trying to strike a romantic connection with him. So all of a sudden he's this object of intense curiosity and interest, where before, he was living in his bedroom at his mother's house, no job, no interaction, known for his social anxieties. And now here he is as this, famous person. So.
Your comment about kind of, trying to uplift oneself, it speaks directly to what we were saying about types and typology and hierarchy and, the Linnaean system of descent, and because yes, it's the disaffected and the unemployed, but it is also people like Gibbs and Agassiz. It's everyone wants to be a step higher. Everyone wants to be a little bit better and find someone to keep down. Bernie, I really appreciate your sort of picking up that thread of stereotypes and the Sambo versus the Nat, and how they are the same person. They are whatever the white speaker wants them to be, really.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what all this is. And there is a very brief description that Agassiz gives about when he actually meets Jem and Alfred and Drana and the others, and when he actually met them and examined them. And we don't know the extent of those examinations and how invasive or violent they may have been, but he talks about them in an article as a question and answer game, that he questioned them, particularly the men, the African men, about their origins and where they were from and what their sort of tribal affiliation was. And he says that these men tried to deceive him, as if he would know, what the true answer is, as if he would know. And that speaks to what Harlan had said about early South Carolinians early white South Carolinians having this pride, this claiming this knowledge about Africans, about their differences, and that they aren't all the same, that there are these subtle differences that only people from South Carolina can see. And it really strikes me that it's the white mind concocting, these images, these obviously stereotypes, but the way they shift and can be applied and changed at will, that they are about white subjectivity more than anything else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sure, because that whole notion of who is a member of what ethnic group and so on was actually very subjective and subject to a lot of distortions on the African coast and the African continent itself. Because, for example, just because one was loaded onto a ship at the mouth of the Niger River or the Sierra Leone River, that doesn't mean that you were actually from that area. You could have been from hundreds of miles away, but nevertheless, the people are, for example, who were picked up in Sierra Leone might have been designated as Mende or Timne or the designation of the largest ethnic groups that happen to be in those places. So there's a lot of presuppositioning about how the slave trade operated and where these people actually were from. But that notion of knowledge about Black people and Africans and so on gets generalized too, and comes all the way down to the present. In other words, if Black people really knew what was in their best interest, they wouldn't be Democrats. they would be Republicans. And so we really have their best interest in mind, and they're really bamboozled by the rhetoric of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and and other Bernie Sanders and so on and so forth. And they're slick, and they really think that they're going to be able to get more welfare this way, and they really don't want to work, lazy, and it all goes back to these original kind of images that are supposedly rooted in the African personality and variations of it. Yeah.
Could I add one thing to that too? It strikes me looking at the old newspapers from around the time of, I was searching through newspapers of 1807 the other day, and noticed how often those descriptions seem to be used just really as marketing tools. So somebody would advertise, slaves from fill in the blank, because they were trying to pump up the price. They were using them as like I said, as marketing ploys, even if they had no idea where people were from. And often a slave ship would contain people from across a fairly wide swath of Africa. So they wasn't like they were all from one village that you knew to be in Senegambia, for instance. But I think that was something that was used by white people as a way just to get more money for themselves.
Sure. I mean, the people who had experience of rice culture were more valuable in South Carolina, but likewise, sometimes those stereotypical representations were merely prejudices. Certain people were more or less honest. Certain people, members of certain ethnic groups were more diligent and hardworking, and so on and so forth. Figments of the master and mistress's imagination.
Right, and all a part of that need to categorize, to put a name to, so you've got this innate behavior possibly in human beings of want to name, going back to Noah, you want to name this, you want to name that. But, again, it gets taken over for the service of self-justification and that kind of, and again, for wealth. But you see that mania for knowledge being abused and using it to maim people.
Absolutely.
The daguerreotypes were never, this relates to a question, but also what you were just saying, Bernie. The daguerreotypes were never published, before the 20th century. They couldn't have been published as photographs anyway, but etchings could have been made of them if Agassiz had or anybody else had wanted to. They were not published. Somebody did ask that question, and then also has a question about the ethics of that, which we can come to. But it strikes me from what you're saying, Bernie, about the way African types were used at that time, and what you were saying, Jennifer, as well, as sort of promotional, as this man is from Guinea, and we all know the Guinea people are good at this, or particularly strong at that. So trying to shape how this person is viewed for commercial purposes. But I could very well see that Agassiz's daguerreotypes, the daguerreotypes could have been used in a treatise about African types, of which there are many that don't have images, but that do reiterate those stereotypes and do perpetuate them, and that is exactly what the the South Carolinians were claiming pride to know that this is knowledge that we have because there are so many people from Africa in our community. I do want to just raise the question because it's an important one that comes up whenever we show these images about the ethics of showing them. And I would like to know sort of your views, our panelists' views. I did not show them all. I only showed a few. I did not show the women whose breasts are exposed. Some of the daguerreotypes show full nudity, front, back, and side. And I tend to not show those either. I think it's important personally that the images are known and seen, and that the history and the people are made visible to the world, but not necessarily paraded out at every opportunity. But I would like to know what you both think. And Jennifer, this also relates to me. I'm really tired of telling Agassiz' story personally, because I find him a reprehensible character, and I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about Delia, and I want to talk about Jam, although I don't know as much about them. The historical record has less to say about them. What are the ethics about telling us Dylan Roof's ideas? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that goes to the reading of some of his text from his manifesto. I think we cannot understand how this is playing forward if we don't understand what was in his mind, or at least what he put on paper. I think that we won't understand how direct those connections are from the stereotypes that we've been discussing today. If we don't know exactly the language used and the offensiveness of the language used. Now, does that mean, to your point earlier, that we read his whole manifesto out loud and utter every every insult that he put down on paper and every terminology that he used? No, I don't think we need to do that. But I do think it's important for us to understand his thinking and how he got there, because otherwise, how are we going to address it? How are we going to try to prevent it? We don't understand it. In my mind, it's really difficult for us to address or even to believe, because I think it's easy for people to maybe believe, oh, it wasn't that bad, until you read it. I remember when these materials were read, the entirety of his manifesto and also his journal he kept in jail after his arrest were read out loud in the courtroom during his trial. And I can tell you, there were a number of family members who had never read them before. And to hear those words and to understand the disturbingness of his views was extremely painful for them, but also very eye-opening for several who described for me this idea of wondering how far and wide is this white supremacy in America? And yet here you are confronted with it in such immediacy. Again, I wouldn't read them out loud. I don't have to. I'm not in a court of law. But I think we do need to understand. And I think for them, that was a pivotal moment. There was one family member, a survivor, who before the trial, I'd asked her, do you see this more as a case that pertains to gun violence or more to race? And she said to gun violence. But after the trial, I asked her the same question, and she said racism. I think understanding his words and his views brought her to that understanding, and I think is important for all of us to understand for those reasons.
To really grasp the nature of the problem.
Exactly, and the power of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting and important question about the display of the images. And so, I think this is a case that is somewhat different for us as students of history. And it is a case where we want to take the primary source, which is the images, and we do want to filter them through our modern sensibilities. But in doing so, and in treating them in a way that we consider proper, given our mores in society, we also have to make sure that we're not obscuring the truth of how they got made, what the full character of the images are, and what their purpose was also. So we have to discuss all of those things, I think, under certain very limited circumstances, particularly the images of the women might be shown, but not as a routine matter. Because for one thing, I think if they are routinely displayed visually, the power gets diminished. And one of the things about filtering them through our modern sensibility, I think, is that we can, by providing limited exposure, preserve the shock value. And that is so very important for a document, an object, a representation of this kind.
You know, and I agree. And I can remember first seeing them in person, you know, at the Peabody, and people are warned, you know, the daguerreotype itself is such a beautiful piece of art, you know, mirror with a memory. But then to see what they're held, again, you see technology used for such ends. They themselves carry such a potent power that you said, if you see the daguerreotypes in person, you're in a one-to-one relationship with them. And you're, you know, you have to get close to them, they're small. And that's when they really convey their power. And you realize they are little items that have traveled down through time. And if the curators allowed you, which of course they wouldn't, you could actually touch them. You can see the handwriting. And that's, Bernie, that's when they have the incredible power. And again, it's what happened with Dylan Roof too. What happens when it gets blown up on the internet, you know, and taken away from its mooring, taken literally away from the case, taken literally away from the context, you know, and that's the danger of it. But it is Pandora's box, you know, it is out. Those images are out and floating around. So, you know, I don't know a solution for that, you know, but, you know, and like I said, they're incredibly powerful. Put them in context, like you say, Bernie, they work and you understand them, but take them out of context, free floating internet, they can cause irreparable damage. And the that I'll use, you know, is, you know, Holocaust photographs. You know, you get dead into the image of seeing these bodies, but they're human beings. And if you go to look for them in the right spirit, Bernie, you see the power. But obviously they can be abused. But to me, that's education. You know, we can't stop them being out there, but if we educate ourselves to look at them in the right perspective, you know, we can't control the internet, but if we can control, you know, through panels like this, through books like yours, where we actually see the horror of what happens when you, like I said, lose the context, you know, that seems to be the only solution about these images. But I do say that the Peabody really maintains them in the kind of honor and the kind of reverence that they deserve.
Thank you all. That was a tough question, and you all tackled it really beautifully. I appreciate that. One of our audience members asks, given the persistence of these narratives, these ugly narratives, how can we counter them? She goes on to write, people promulgating racist ideologies are clearly basing their ideas on inaccuracies and lies, such as the websites that radicalized Ruth. You know, and the audience member refers to the quote, stolen election. You know, how do we call these lies out? How do we reconcile? How do we heal? And Jennifer, you did mention a couple of really good examples about removing symbols of hate, about removing the Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol and the Calhoun statue. But you know, what can we do?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question right now. It's really, really difficult. And I can say as a journalist, this is absolutely one of the biggest challenges that we face, is trying to disseminate facts in a day when people will find whatever they want to believe and just believe it. If we don't have an understanding that we're working from a common set of facts, it's really difficult to have a conversation that's based in reality from there. It's really difficult, but I think that persistence, I think there are a lot of people who really do want accurate information. I also think that conversations like this one and a renewed attention to all kinds of books and writings that are very useful, everything from books like Caste to Henry Louis Gates' book Stony the Road, for me was a really interesting look at how this narrative was formed through all kinds of marketing and gizmos you could purchase with African-American caricatures on them, and just that kind of education. I really encourage people to look beyond your world and read some of this, because I can just say as a middle-aged white woman that I didn't learn a lot of the things I needed to learn in school. I'm not from South Carolina. We lived all over the place. And still I didn't learn that. I didn't learn that about the narrative. I learned about Reconstruction, then this sort of ended, and that was sad. And then we had the civil rights movement, I really encourage people that I know to go out and educate yourselves a little bit on this. And I am encouraged that I think the country as a whole is talking more about these issues, that the Black Lives Matter movement and the many social justice conversations that we've had in the past few years is raising awareness of that. But I don't want to sugarcoat anything, and that I think disinformation is one of the biggest obstacles that we're going to face moving forward. And the technology we just discussed is enabling that. I don't know what the answer is to that, but it's a tremendous problem.
The technology is enabling it, as we've discussed, but it's also enabling the sort of counter narrative. It's how we see violence against Black people. That has always been happening, but that white people did not see it. And now it's on TV, it's on YouTube. It is tragically visible, but also effectively visible.
And right here in South Carolina, you had the case of Walter Scott, and it was just a few months before Emmanuel, where a white police officer shot and killed Walter Scott. And at first that appeared to be somewhat justified, or it wasn't getting much attention. But the minute that cell phone video came out, everything changed. Everything changed. And so to your point, we have that now.
And Walter Scott's assailant was jailed, unlike so many of the other people, in the Black Lives Matter thing and the issue with the George Floyd going on now. That is part of the narrative, that juries did see that, and they did send the assailant to jail. Just briefly, I think a museum like Bernie's opening too is going to be an incredible, powerful tool for that as well. I'm sure, school children of South Carolina learning the inaccurate things about Reconstruction, as I did in their textbooks. But Bernie, if it's nothing other than school children and school buses of South Carolina children going through the International African American Museum and seeing something in person, not on through a video screen, I think that can be a powerful tool in changing the narrative, especially when we get children when they're young. And I think that actually a physical spot will make it more reverent. Artifacts that, again, traveled through time, like the daguerreotypes themselves, I think that can have an incredibly strong impact, and it can start the counter narrative or the true narrative.
Yeah, that's obviously my thinking also, and the thinking of the staff, the donors, and everyone behind the museum there. I think, ultimately, and it's not a cliche, but in a democracy, the only thing we have is education. We've got to vest our hopes in education, because that is what will make a democracy, well, let's put it this way, that will enable a democracy to survive. And it's and you know, I think it is not an exaggeration to say that the vitals of our democracy are being gnawed at right now, and we've seen that, and so we have got to join hands with the Holocaust Museum, with the National Museum, and other kinds of sites of education and memory to combat those who don't want to deal with facts and who want to just deal with emotion and build a cult of personality around individuals. And so we've got a lot of work cut out for us to do, but ultimately it is going to be through this process of education and creating powerful voices and powerful spaces for truth tellers to exist and to flourish. And of course, this is what has happened historically. I mean, when one thinks about it, the transformation in American life from the late 19th century to the end of the 1960s, yes, it was brought about by demonstrations and people taking to the streets. Yes, that's absolutely right. But there was a heck of a lot of transformation that occurred in people's minds through educational initiatives too. And so I think ultimately this is where we've got to devote our energy, and we've got to appreciate those things that are positive where we see them. Yes, there are a lot of things that have happened recently that are suggestive of the period of post-Reconstruction and things that are going on right now. That's absolutely right. Except the difference is, during that time period, the progressive forces had virtually no allies at all. But we see that they exist. They exist in the country, across the artificial chasms of religion and gender and race and all of these. And we even see international voices being raised to speak to and reinforce the good issues that are being dealt with here in our country. And so there's reason for hope. There's reason for hope.
That's a terrific place to draw this to a close, I think. Thank you, Bernie, for leaving us with that message in particular. I'd like to thank our guests tonight who've been really tremendous. Harlan Greene, Bernard Powers, and Jennifer Berry Hawes. You've all been really terrific, sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your thoughts with us. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Kyla Bowen, who manages everything for us behind the scenes and does so flawlessly. And I want to thank Denny Valentine for her administrative support. To those of you in the audience, this event has been recorded and you will get notification when it is available on our YouTube channel. So you can view it again if you wish, or if you missed part of it, and share it with your friends and family. Again, thank you all for joining us. I wish you a good night and take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.